In this presentation, I'm going to talk about security policy, how we develop security policies, sort of some of the concepts behind security policy. Certainly, one way we don't create security policy is by coming up with a bunch of rules that we're going to enforce kind of haphazardly and throwing together a policy. There are very accepted methods and vernacular that deal with IT security policy. One of the first things they talk about in your book are these four concepts of policies, standards, procedures, and guidelines. So generally, policies are very wide-reaching. It's a very broad and very vague. Usually, a policy. For example, a policy might be that we want to protect our data and ensure that passwords are, complicated enough that they can't be cracked. That might be a very generic policy. And then standards support creation of specific policies, or standards can give us frameworks for policies, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The procedures support the policy. They tell you how you can implement that policy. And then guidelines are suggestions for how to comply with the policy. And I'll give you an example of this later in the lecture. But one way that I like to explain how this all relates to each other, luckily you guys have already had the opportunity to learn a little bit about regulation and laws in previous units in the course. So when we talked about regulation and law, I talked about how the laws, or U.S. code, for example, United States, are very broad. They give you a very generic goal of what they're trying to accomplish. But the day-to-day operational ways to enforce and to make sure those laws are being followed are actually created by various departments within the government, and they create the procedures and the guidelines. Or in that example, you've got U.S. code, which tells you, basically is the law. And then you have regulations, which are put in place by the organizations charged with enforcing those laws. For example, Congress may pass a law that we want to reduce air pollution. The EPA creates regulations that define exactly how we're going to do that. And guidelines can give you suggested ways to do it. So that's kind of the relationship there. So in many cases, when we create IT security policy, we start with a standard. So one of the nice things about IT security policy is there are already in existence a lot of the policies that you would need for a successful information security program already exist. The frameworks already exist. A lot of this work has already been done for you. You simply need to adapt those standards to your own policies. We're going to talk in the next slide deck after this one. I talk about specific standards and specific frameworks that we have that help support this. But once we have a policy in place, then we come up with the guidelines and the procedures that support that policy. You can think of the procedures and the guidelines as more technical documents, where the policy is more of a political document or more of a management document. So how exactly do we do this? So IT security policy compliance. So the controls support policy, as I talked about. The policy supports the business requirements, and the business requirements are derived from the regulatory requirements. So in most organizations, we start with the regulatory requirements. And I haven't talked about regulatory requirements much in this lecture, but we've talked about these before. So we've in prior slide decks, we've talked about how it's important that we comply with regulatory requirements. We talked about why they exist and so forth. So those regulatory requirements might drive business requirements, which then drives the creation of our policies for our IT security program, for which we develop the controls to enforce and to make sure that we can comply with those policies. In this course, I've talked about the different roles, or as far as personnel goes for IT security. To put this in perspective for you, the policies are generally, the responsible parties for the policies are generally your CISO or Chief Information Security Officer, the CTO, and anyone else in the executive or C-suite. The development of those controls, which are the procedures and guidelines, generally falls to the management of the IT security department and the technical or the technicians in IT security. So just to reiterate, the policy is the types of protections that we require and why those protections are needed. So sort of the what and the why of what we're trying to accomplish, whereas the controls are the how. Those are the specific details on exactly how we're going to implement and support that policy. So it's the technical details that are going to support that policy. In a lot of cases, the controls are the more difficult things to come up with, because you have to understand all of the technology and how you're going to support that policy. It's great if we have all of these IT security policies that we're confident are going to expand or enforce our IT security program. But we have to have some oversight. We have to have some objective way to measure whether or not these policies are working. So one method is we want to ask ourselves if the policy is achieving the desired results. Policies should, in general, include information on how those policies, or what oversight is going to enforce that policy or ensure that we're actually following those policies. So in many cases, we'll talk about the identification of measurements that can help us assess whether or not the policy is being followed. So for example, how many, we might have some kind of an audit requirement for passwords to make sure that we can't crack passwords, for example. And we might have some reporting requirements to ensure that the policies are being followed. And you can see on the graphic on the right-hand side, we're constantly measuring, reviewing, tracking, monitoring, so that we can improve our policies over time. Not even necessarily improving the policies themselves, but also improving our adoption and enforcement of those policies. Basically, our policy oversight ensures that there is accountability to our policies, and we're being held accountable to these policies and ensuring that they're being followed. So the process to create a policy, generally we start with recognizing some need for a policy to be developed. Once we recognize that need, we're going to collect documents that relate to the new policy. So we might be looking at standards, we might be baselining what other organizations are doing, and so forth. We're going to analyze any existing policies that we already have for any overlap with the policy that we're trying to implement. Perhaps some of these things are covered in other policies. We don't want to be redundant. We develop a case study relating to the new policy to understand what it is exactly we're trying to do. We examine existing frameworks for policies that already can be used. So in many cases, as I mentioned before, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide deck, there are already policy frameworks in place that already have examples of these policies that have been developed by these standard organizations. We'll talk more about those later. We can also develop our own framework internally, and in many cases, we're using sort of a combination of all of those. Once we have that in place, we're going to implement the new policy, and we're going to add the policy change control board process. In other words, we're going to try to adopt this policy. As far as a policy itself, so when you're developing a policy, it's going to have, obviously, it's going to be mostly documents. So a policy is going to be a collection of documents that make up our overall policy. Within that document, you'll usually have some kind of purpose and mission for your policy. Why are we trying to adopt this policy? What is the purpose for this policy? What is the goal of this policy? And I don't talk much about it in this class, but that's an important step because it helps explain to people why we have this policy. Users are more apt to follow policies if they understand why they're important. The responsibilities for enforcing the policy will be in this document. Any compliance issues covered by the new policy. In other words, maybe we're implementing this policy because of some new regulatory compliance issues. We'll talk more about regulation later on. And then the scope of the policy coverage. So who it covers, what processes it covers, business units, etc. Now you'll notice that the policy itself doesn't really contain anything about how exactly to follow the policy and any technical specifics. Those would be in other documents that would be supporting this policy. The reason that those would be in other documents is because they would change more often. Generally, our policy documents should be sort of set in stone. They're very broad, and they have very broad goals, and they're not going to change that often. Our goal to protect our network from attackers is not really going to change. That's always going to be a goal. But what is going to change is the technical specifics on supporting that policy. And those are much easier for us to change. So the policies kind of give us direction on exactly what we're trying to do. And then the specifics are what we find in our guidelines our procedures, and our controls, which I'll talk about as well. So there are really two ways that we derive regulations that drive our policy decisions or what policies we adopt. And a lot of these, these are all external forces on our policies. Obviously, we have a very strong self-interest to protect our company, to protect our organizations, and to protect our network. As a result of our desire to protect those other things, we want to protect our network and our infrastructure and our capital. But some of these policies are driven from external sources, such as government regulations. And the reason we have these government regulations, number one, and it's important to understand the motivation behind these regulations, but number one is consumer protection, to protect our customers. Sometimes the organization's best interests do not align with their consumer or their customer's best interests. So regulations, that's one reason for regulations, to try to push that on organizations. A stable economy, things like the SEC and so forth. Their goal, of course, is for a stable economy to make sure that insider trading isn't causing issues. Most of you probably remember the housing crisis in 2008. And that's a perfect example of where regulation could probably help stabilize the economy. Whether you lean to the left or the right, I think we can all agree that some regulation is certainly required. And then finally, tax revenue. That's the reality of our republic and our world, is that in many cases, laws and regulations are in place to help generate tax revenue for supposedly the greater good. There's also industry self-regulation. So while some regulations come from the government, in many cases, regulation is coming from the industry itself. It seems rather counterintuitive that an industry would coalesce with one another in order to self-regulate, but the reason they do that is self-regulation in many cases is going to be far cheaper than government regulation. So most organizations, if you can, you want to avoid government regulation. So some industries adopt policies and procedures and standards that they apply industry-wide that you have to adopt in order to participate in that industry. One perfect example of that is PCI compliance for accepting credit cards. The banks will not allow you to accept credit cards electronically unless you comply with those policies that they lay out in their standard in PCI. So that's a great example of where the industry is self-regulated. The government didn't have to come in and regulate that. Since the banks take on that risk, they also regulate that industry. So it's much more flexible than, say, a government regulation. So industry standards can turn into best practices and leading practices, which is discussed briefly in your textbook. But a lot of these standards that we talk about for framework standards, that is, for IT security policies, are derived from these industry self-regulation. And we're going to talk about some of those later on. So some of those are PCI DSS, which is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standards, which everyone who accepts credit cards must comply with these. SAS 70, Statement on Auditing Standard, which depending on what organization you're in, you may be required to adopt or to comply with those standards. There's ITIL, or the Information Technology Infrastructure Library, and so forth and so on. So IT security policies, when you adopt and implement and enforce IT security policy, you're going to have increased availability. You're going to protect from insider threats. You're going to have better risk management, change control, and data protection, all good things. But without information security policies, you're going to have higher cost, non-compliance, in all likelihood, non-compliance with regulations, vulnerability to mishandled data, vulnerability to attack, all of the things that we're trying to avoid. So having IT security policies to hold us accountable will help us thrive with our information security program. So regulations in general are designed to protect individuals, shareholders, and public interest, which we talked about briefly before. So it may protect individuals' privacy and consumer rights. Shareholders promote trust, or protecting shareholders promotes trust and a healthy economy, trust for shareholders to invest in companies, and of course, public interest. It kind of forces us to have something beyond self-interest. In a in a purest sense, most organizations' fiduciary responsibility is to themselves, not to society as a whole. So regulations help kind of spread that out beyond the organization. So the components of an IT security policy, if you're developing a framework. So first, the policy defines how we perform and conduct business functions and transactions. So one thing I like to talk about when I talk about why we have security policies, this is a quote from a textbook that I used years ago. A firewall is the implementation of your internet security policy. If you haven't got a security policy, you haven't got a firewall. Instead, you've got a thing that's sort of doing something, but you don't know what it's trying to do because no one has told you what it should do. In other words, if we have a firewall, my apologies for the coughing. So basically, if we don't have a policy and we have a firewall, then how exactly do we configure that firewall? What kind of traffic are we going to block? What traffic are we going to allow? Who makes that decision? And in a lot of organizations that don't utilize IT security policies, those decisions are made autonomously by the people who administer those devices. They don't always make the right decisions, and they don't always align them with the organization's goals. So having security policy tells us exactly how those devices are going to support the overall organization. One of the things I've heard from students in the past, especially in this program, who work in IT security, they talk about how strapped their IT security program is for money. And a lot of times, after talking to them, I realized that they're working in a bubble and they're not working with the overall organization. So they don't have any representation in the C-suite. They're not really seen as a core component to the organization. And IT security policy definitely helps us do that. It helps us align ourselves and makes everyone aware of what we're doing and holds us accountable. So it's certainly important. All right, so we have standards, which are an established method that's implemented organization-wide, which I talked about before. The procedures, which exactly how we implement that policy. And then finally, guidelines, which are sort of suggestions on how we can carry out those procedures, maybe for different components or for different architectures and so forth. So usually, an IT security framework starts with a program charter. Below that, you would basically brainstorm the different areas of IT security policy that you're going to have. And here's an example of 4 different areas. There could certainly be a lot more. And then within each one of those, you would have control standards that support those policies and guidelines, which are suggestions, more or less, to support those. And then finally, the day-to-day procedures to actually implement those. So, as an example, let's say we had an access control policy, and one of those is a password standard. So in other words, the access control policy is that we want to protect our network by having passwords, that are secure. So then we develop or we use a password standard. So for most of you, if I asked you what is a secure password, a lot of you would probably give me some rules. Are you making up those rules? In most cases, you're not making them up. You've seen them somewhere else. Other people have used those rules, and those are what standards are. So the standards are basically rules that we're implementing that are industry best practice or that we've developed in-house that we understand to be best practice. So the standard might be that passwords have to be a minimum length, they have to have certain characters in them, and so forth and so on. From that standard, you may have substandards. You may have a standard for Unix. You may have a different standard for Microsoft. And you can see here we're getting more and more specific. Then you would, and by the way, the password standard would be the control standard. And then the 2 below that, how we are the technical or baseline standards, which tell us exactly how we implement that control standard. And then below that, we have the actual procedure. So how we would enforce the Unix password standard, would be in the Unix procedure. So we would actually put in there exactly how you would configure a Unix machine to make sure that that policy is being followed. Likewise, you would have the same thing for Microsoft. So maybe one set of procedures for server and a different set of procedures for desktop. You would also allow for exceptions in your policy. And this is a very important concept. One of the things we get lost in far too often with IT security is coming up with these IT security policies, but not having a framework for exceptions to those policies. Let's use passwords as an example. Let's say you have a requirement that your passwords are a minimum of 16 characters and certain characters, letters, numbers, symbols, and things like that. But let's say you have a software application that does not support greater than 8 characters. Well, does that mean that you're going to not allow that software to run in your network? That may not be feasible for your business or for the organization. So that means that we're going to have to break the rules. Well, we don't want people to break the rules with any degree of regularity because that's going to degrade from our policies. So instead, we want to work into our policies and into our standards a way to have exceptions to that policy and the reasonings for doing so, and maybe even requirements that explain exactly how or why somebody would do that or under what circumstances that's permissible. So certainly exceptions are very important. So basically, to review, when we implement security policy, we start with reviewing exactly what those policies need to be. We put those policies to paper to make sure that they're codified into some policy that we can reference, make sure everyone is aware of those policies. We make them standardized throughout the organization. We provide the procedures and the guidelines and the control standards and the technical standards that I talked about. And then finally, when all of that's done, we make sure people are aware of those policies going forward. So we'll use awareness training. I'm going to talk about awareness training in a different slide deck. In the next slide deck, I'm going to discuss frameworks. So we'll talk about some different IT security frameworks that have already been developed that we can use to create our IT security policies. So it gives us a great starting point. We can either augment from those or we can simply adopt some of those. We'll talk about that in the next slide deck. Then we'll talk about awareness training in the slide deck after that.